Gold Rush widower inherited a played-out claim for 16 cents. Discovered a Chinese bride panning silver. The deed was folded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases, like old skin. I'd carried it from St. Louis to Independence to a mule-track road that didn't have a name, and by the time I got to the creek, the ink on the surveyor's marks had bled into the fiber and you could barely read what it said. Didn't matter. I knew what it said. 80 feet of streambed on the north fork of a drainage called Quarry Creek, Calaveras County, California, transferred upon the death of one Eli Birch to one Thomas Aldous Crail. That was me, in settlement of a debt of record, assessed value 16 cents. 16 cents. I stood at the bank of that creek in the second week of October, 1852, and I looked at the water running over gray rock and I thought, this is what's left of you, Eli, 16 cents and a hole in the ground. I wasn't angry. Eli had owed me $43 and he'd died owing it, and now I owned a strip of played-out streambed in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, which was a strange way to collect a debt. But it was the only offer the estate made, and I'd taken it because I had nowhere else to be. My wife had been dead 11 months. Clara, she died in March, a Thursday, before the forsythia came up. Fever. I won't say more about that. I will say that after she was gone, I couldn't stay in the house we'd had on Chowdo Avenue, couldn't sleep in the room, couldn't sit at the table where she used to put her coffee cup in the same place every morning, to the left of the saucer, handle turned in always. Couldn't do it. Sold what I could. Gave the rest to her sister. Got on a horse and went west because west was a direction and I needed a direction and I didn't have one anymore. I was 49 years old that October. My hair had gone the color of creek gravel. I had a prospector's pan, a short-handled pick, a cook pot with a cracked handle, a blanket that needed replacing, and enough flour and salt pork to get through 2 weeks if I was careful. I had my rifle. I had Eli's 16-cent deed. I had underneath the deed in the breast pocket of my coat a daguerreotype of Clara that I had not looked at since Independence and could not make myself throw away. I set up camp on the bank. I had prospected before, not seriously, not with any real belief in it, but I'd worked gravel a few times in Missouri and I understood the pan. You fill it at the water line, you tilt, you let the water carry off the light material, you watch what settles. What settles is what's heavy. Gold is heavy. So is iron. So is a lot of things that aren't gold. You learn the difference by feel and by the particular way light catches what's left on the bottom of the pan. Gold has a warmth to it that iron doesn't, a softness, a color that doesn't change when the water dries off. Iron looks dead when it dries. Gold still looks like gold. I worked the first morning and found iron, and small round quartz pebbles, and a fishhook that had been there so long it had rusted down to a thin brown line, barely a hook anymore. The second morning I found the same. By the third morning I had satisfied myself that Eli Birch had known exactly what he was doing when he took the 16-cent assessment and the deed, and handed the whole sorry package to his estate attorney as payment against my $43. He had robbed me from beyond the grave. I found this mildly funny, in the way that things become funny when they aren't surprising. That was the morning I saw the woman. She was 50 yards upstream, in the shallows on the far bank, working a pan with both hands. She was Chinese. Small, not slight, she had a stocky, solid build, wide shoulders for her height, and she was wearing a man's canvas jacket 2 sizes too large and a flat-brimmed hat that had been repaired along the crown with what looked like copper wire. She was working the pan the way someone works it who has done it 10,000 times. No wasted motion, no drama, just a steady tilt and drain and settle. She didn't look up when I came to the bank. She kept working. I watched her for a moment, then went back to my own side and worked my own stretch. She was there again the next morning, and the morning after that, we didn't speak. I don't know that she spoke any English, and I certainly didn't speak any Chinese. We just worked our respective pieces of the creek, 50 yards apart, and that was all. I want to tell this the right way because I've told it wrong before. I've made it sound like it happened quickly, or like it happened the way things happen in stories, with a moment and a turning point you can put your finger on. It didn't. It accumulated the way sediment does. Slowly and from many directions, and you don't notice the accumulation until one day you look down and the bottom has changed. The first time she acknowledged I was there was on the 5th or 6th day. I was eating my noon meal, hardtack and salt pork, sitting on a rock, and she came downstream along her bank, stopped, looked at me without any particular expression, and held up a tin cup. A question. I nodded. She went upstream to where she'd set up a small fire, and a few minutes later she came back and put the cup down on a flat rock at the water's edge on her side and stepped back. I waded across. The cup was tea, not black tea, something with a particular green smell I didn't have a name for, slightly bitter, not unpleasant. I drank it standing there on her bank. She watched me. When I finished, I held the cup out to her and said, "Thank you." She took the cup and said something I didn't understand and went back upstream. I thought about that cup of tea for the rest of the afternoon. I don't know why. There wasn't anything to think about. She'd offered tea, I'd drunk it, I'd said thank you. But I kept turning it over. The way you turn a smooth stone over in your hand for no reason except that it fits there and the weight of it is right. Her name, I would learn much later, was Mei Zing. She'd come to California with her husband in 1849, when the rush was still new and men were still making fortunes and the creeks were not yet played out. Her husband had died of cholera in the summer of 1850, and she had stayed. She had no family in California and no money to get back to China, and as she would explain to me much later in the careful, building English she had taught herself from a torn primer and a Methodist hymnal. The two books she owned. She had nowhere in China that was better than here. Her people were from a province inland, farming people, and they were poor and there had been a flood and her family was scattered. California was poor too, but the poverty here was the kind where a woman alone could still work and still eat and still make decisions for herself, and that counted for something. She had been working that stretch of creek for almost 2 years. Her claim was the 30 feet directly opposite mine. I found this out gradually over weeks, in the halting, patient, sometimes silent conversation of people who are building a common language from two separate ones. She spoke better than I first assumed. She'd been practicing on miners upstream, she said, though most of them weren't patient enough for it. I was patient. I had nothing but time and an unproductive pan, and the certain knowledge that sitting with another person in the early dark beat sitting alone in it, which is not a romantic thought but an honest one. I will tell you what the creek was like in October in those hills, because it matters to the story. The water ran cold, not the bracing cold of a stream in summer that feels good on your wrists, the cold that has a weight to it that settles into your hands and stays. By mid-morning, my fingers were numb past the second knuckle. You learn to work by feel rather than sensation. The gravel at the bottom of the pan becomes a thing you know by touch rather than by feeling. You know the shape of a pebble without feeling it, the way you know the layout of a room in the dark because you've walked it enough times. The hills on both sides of the creek were going gold and amber. Not the gold you look for in the pan, the other kind, the kind that doesn't spend. Cottonwoods, big leaf maple, the oaks staying green longer than everything else, stubborn. In the afternoon, the light came through at a low angle and turned the creek the color of old brass. At night, you could hear coyotes so far off they sounded like a rumor. I was not a man who talked to himself. Clara had cured me of that early in our marriage. She said it was a sign of a restless mind, and a restless mind was a mind that needed occupation. She was right. But out there alone, I found myself talking to the creek. Not prayers, not anything with words, just sounds occasionally when I lifted the pan and found iron again, an old grievance kept private. What I was actually grieving working that creek was not Eli Birch's 16 cents. You understand this. You come out to a place like that because you need somewhere to put the grief, some physical work to pour it into, because if you sit in a chair in a house in St. Louis with it, it will eat you alive. The creek was useful. The cold was useful. The daily failure of the pan was, in its way, useful, because it gave me something to be disappointed about. That wasn't Clara. I thought about her less than I expected to, and more than I could stand. The first time Mei Zing came to my side of the creek was a Tuesday in late October. She waded across in the afternoon, shoes and all. She didn't bother taking them off and stood beside me and looked at my pan. She looked at it a long time. Then she pointed upstream, past my 60 feet of claim, past the next bend. I said I didn't understand. She crouched down and drew in the mud with her finger. She drew the creek, the bend, a line representing the far bank. She pointed at the far bank upstream and said a word I didn't know, then 2 English words, silver, different. I looked at the drawing, I looked upstream. I said, that's not my claim. She shrugged, she tapped the drawing. She said, nobody. Then she stood up and waded back across. I thought about it for 3 days. The stretch she'd pointed at was beyond both our claims, unclaimed ground from what I could tell. Nobody'd bothered marking it. Nobody was working it. I told myself I wasn't going to poach. I told myself I was a man who respected property law even in places where property law was whatever the biggest man in camp decided it was. I told myself a lot of things. On the fourth day, I walked upstream and looked. The bend she'd pointed at was where two small tributaries joined the main channel. The geology changed there, darker rock, a different composition, a seam of something lighter running through the face of the near bank. I crouched and looked at it. I am not a geologist, but I had worked enough gravel to know that a seam like that was worth a pan. I filled the pan at the tributary mouth. What settled at the bottom was not gold. It was a fine, bright material that caught the light differently, more silver than yellow, with a particular kind of flash, almost like mica but heavier. I stared at it. I carried it back downstream on the flat of the pan, moving slowly so as not to disturb it, and brought it to the bank. Mei Xing was on her side of the creek watching me. I held the pan up. She said something in Chinese that I took for a confirmation. She had known. She'd known it was there and she'd told me. Her claim was 30 feet, same as mine, and the tributary confluence was 20 feet past her northern boundary. She couldn't work it herself without tools she didn't have and more physical strength than she had, because the bank there was steep and the material was packed hard and getting at it was a two-person job. She had needed someone, and she had decided, I realized, that I was someone she could use. Which sounds cold until you understand that it wasn't cold. It was the precise and unsentimental calculation of a woman who had survived 3 years alone in the California hills and knew better than to romanticize necessity. I was not insulted. I was, if anything, steadied by it, the idea that I was useful to something, that I was chosen for a practical reason by a practical mind. After 11 months of being a man walking around in a kind of fog, the sensation of being specifically useful to a specific person was something I had not expected to feel again, and I will not exaggerate what it was. It was not love, not yet, not close, but it was the first edge of something, the first place where the ground under my feet felt solid. We worked the tributary confluence together from the 1st of November. The arrangement was wordless for the most part. I had the tools, the pick, a longer-handled shovel I'd bought from a miner leaving camp, a second pan. She had the knowledge. She knew the formation, she knew the seam, she could read the rock in a way I couldn't, and I learned to watch her hands and her eyes rather than try to interpret what she said. When she stopped and looked at a section of bank, I stopped. When she shook her head, I moved the tools elsewhere. When she pointed, I dug. We split what we found equally. This was never discussed. It was simply what happened. What we found was not a fortune. I want to be clear about that because I have told this story before and people hear silver and they imagine a bonanza, a vein, men with shovels in a mine with timber supports and lanterns. It was nothing like that. It was fine silver in low concentration in a wet gravel formation at the confluence of two small streams, and working it full days we could produce together perhaps $4 or $5 worth of material per week, which was not a fortune but was more than nothing, more than iron filings and quartz pebbles, more than I'd found on my own 16-cent claim. It was enough to buy flour and buy salt and pay for the mule track road occasionally, and think about the next week rather than just the next day. We began to talk more. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Building a common language with another person is a slow kind of intimacy, slow and patient, and full of misfires and corrections and moments when something doesn't translate, and you sit with the gap between you and wait for a way across. She had more English than I knew and I had no Chinese at all, and so the weight of the language building fell on her and I tried to lighten that by learning what I could. She taught me her name properly. Mei Xing, 2 syllables, a particular tone on each that I could not reproduce correctly for weeks, and that made her laugh when I got it wrong. Not a mocking laugh, just a laugh. It was the first time I heard her laugh, and it was a surprise, high and brief and genuine, and it changed her face completely, and I thought about it afterward in the way I'd thought about the cup of tea. I found out about her husband in the 2nd week of November. She told it without much ceremony. He had been a good man, she said, and she missed him, and she had done what she had to do after he died and would keep doing it. She said this looking at the creek, not at me. I said I understood. She looked at me then, a quick, assessing look, the kind of look that takes inventory. I said my wife had died in the spring. She nodded. She went back to work. That was the whole conversation. We didn't revisit it. But something shifted after that, some mutual acknowledgement, some recognition that we were both people carrying a specific kind of weight, the kind that doesn't get lighter but that you get stronger for carrying. That recognition has a particular quality. It doesn't mean you feel sorry for each other. It means you know what the other person knows. That's different from pity, and it's different from sympathy, and it is, I think, the beginning of respect. November deepened. The cold got serious. I need to tell you about the cold, because the cold is part of this. Working in that creek in November, Calaveras County, 1852, was a specific physical experience that I can describe, but you cannot fully imagine unless you have done it. The water was at a temperature that stopped being merely uncomfortable around the third week of the month and became a thing you worked against. Standing in it past your knees, which is where you had to stand to work the confluence, meant that by the end of each day your legs were a dull ache all the way to the hip, and your hands had moved past numb into a state that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite not pain. At night my knuckles swelled. I wrapped them in cloth strips cut from the spare shirt I'd brought, which helped some. I built the fire bigger at night than I needed for warmth, needing the light as much as the heat. The hills closed in fast at dark in November, and the dark had a weight to it that pressed down on a man alone. I was still alone at night. We did not make camp together. She had her camp 50 yards upstream, mine was where I'd made it in October, and we worked together in the days and separated at dark, and that was the shape of things. I thought about this more than I should have. I thought about the fire upstream, just visible through the cottonwoods on still nights. I thought about it and told myself I was thinking about it because I was lonely, and loneliness makes a man's mind go to wherever light is, which is true, but was not the whole truth. There was a night in late November when I heard something wrong from upstream. It was after dark, maybe 2 hours after dark, and I was at my fire with the rifle across my knees. I slept with it across my knees most nights, had since independence old habit, and I heard a raised voice and then another raised voice, and they were men's voices, and they were not happy voices. Then silence. Then the sound of something knocked over. I was on my feet without deciding to be. I went up the creek bank in the dark, no lantern, moving by the starlight and the sound of the water. There were 2 men at her camp. I could see them by her fire, big men, miners, older than me by the look of them, a particular kind of large and confident that men get when they've decided the territory belongs to them. She was standing between her cook pot and her tent, still, not making a sound, watching them. One of them was saying something about the confluence, about the silver, about how a Chinese woman had no legal right to work unclaimed ground, about how if she was smart she'd move along. He was saying this in the tone men use when they've already decided the conversation is over. I came into the firelight. I said, "She works with me." They looked at me. One of them, the talker, looked at me the way men look when they're deciding whether to bother. I am not a large man. I was 49 years old and gray, and I had been living on salt pork and creek work for 6 weeks, and I did not look like a man worth bothering with. He looked at me for a long moment. I held the rifle at my side. Not raised, just there. He said, "You married to her." I said, "She works with me. That's the second time I've said it." He looked at the rifle. He looked at me. He was calculating. I know what he was calculating, and I will tell you that I was not calculating anything. I had gone past that to a place that was very clear and very still, the way things get clear when you've already decided. Whether he saw that or whether he simply decided 2 women and an old man wasn't worth the trouble, I'll never know. But he said something to his companion, and they went back downstream, and I listened to them go. She hadn't moved. After a long moment she said, "Your claim." I said, "Mine and yours, same claim." She looked at me, not the inventory look, something different, a longer look, quieter. I didn't know what to do with it, so I checked the camp, made sure nothing had been taken, made sure the fire was banked right, made sure she had water, and then I went back to my camp. I lay down with the rifle alongside me and looked at the stars through the open tent flap and thought, "You are a damn fool, Thomas Crail." I didn't sleep well. In the morning she was at the confluence before I was, already working, and when I waded in she didn't look up, just moved to the left side to give me room the way she always did. But at noon when we stopped she handed me a piece of something flat, fried, made of rice flour, with a faint sweetness I didn't have a name for. She had made them that morning before I was up. She handed it to me and went back to the water without a word. I stood there and ate it. That was November. December brought snow. Not a big snow, the foothills don't get the snow the higher elevations do, but enough to change the light and quiet the camp and make the creek look like a different creek. She had better cold-weather gear than I did. She had a padded jacket, Chinese-made. She'd had it since before she came to California, and good boots with extra wrapping inside them. I had my coat and the blanket and the wrapped knuckles. By December, the confluence was producing less. The seam was thinning. We both knew it. We didn't discuss it. We worked what was there. One evening in the first week of December, I came back to camp and found a pair of wool socks on my bedroll. Not my socks, these were handmade, thick, slightly too large, clearly knitted by hand. I stood and looked at them for a time, then I put them on. They were the warmest thing I'd felt since Missouri. I want to tell you about a particular afternoon in December that I have thought about more times than I can count. It was a clear day, cold but clear, and we had stopped working around midday because the material was thin and not worth the time. We were sitting on the bank on her side, just sitting, the way you sometimes do when there's nothing pressing and the sun is out and the creek sounds like itself. She was mending the copper wire on her hat, the repair on the crown, her fingers moving without her watching them. I was watching the water. She said, out of nothing, in the particular mix of English and gesture she used when she was saying something she'd been working out how to say, "You stay." I said, "I'm staying until the claim runs out." She shook her head. She said, "No, you stay, not the claim." I looked at her. She was not looking at me. She was looking at her hat, at the wire she was twisting. Her face was composed, the same composed face she brought to the creek every morning. But her ears had gone slightly red, which I had noticed before when she was embarrassed or uncertain, and her hands had stopped moving. I said, "You want me to stay?" She said, and this was the most words at once she had put together in careful, deliberate English, and I knew she had rehearsed them. "I watch you. 6 weeks. 7 now. You are a steady man. You do not hit. You do not take. You stand between the bad men and do not think too long about it. You work. You are fair. These things are not common." She said it all to the hat. Then she looked at me. She said, "I am not common either." "No," I said, "you are not." She said so. I said nothing for a moment. The creek ran. I said I had a wife. "I know," she said. I said it's not an easy thing, starting again. She said, "I know this too." I looked at her. She was looking at me with a directness that was characteristic of her. She never approached a thing sideways, and in that directness was something I can only describe as patience. Not patience in the waiting sense. Patience in the sense of, I have thought this through and I am still here. She was not asking me for love. She was not asking me to forget. She was asking me to stay, which is a different thing and in some ways a harder thing, and she was asking it because she had watched me for 7 weeks and she had decided, not on a feeling, but on evidence, the way she decided everything, that I was the kind of man worth asking. I had not been that man for 11 months. I had been a man in a fog, a man going through motions, a man who packed his things and went west because west was a direction. I said, "I'll need to put in for a legal extension of the claim, both names." She said, "I know a man at the land office. I go many times. He is used to me." I said, "Both names." She said, "Both names." We sat on the bank in the December sun with the creek running and the socks warm on my feet, and neither of us said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. She went back to the hat. The copper wire caught the light. I watched the water. I thought about Clara. I always think about Clara. You don't stop, that's not how it works, and anyone who tells you it works that way is either young or lying. You don't stop, you carry it. But you can carry it and still be alive. You can carry it and still have your hands in the cold water and still eat rice flour cakes at noon and still feel the weight of a man's purpose when a woman looks at you and says, "You are a steady man." Clara would have liked her. This is not a thing I say to be at peace with myself. It is a true thing. Clara had no patience with weakness and no interest in soft people, and she would have looked at Mei Zing and seen someone who made decisions and kept them, and she would have respected that completely. That helped me. We filed the extension in late December. Her English name, the one she had taken for legal purposes from the Methodist hymnal, was Mary. Mary Crail after we married in January in front of a justice of the peace in a town called Moclumney Hill. The ceremony was brief. The justice of the peace was a man named Patterson who had seen stranger things than a gray-haired widower from St. Louis marrying a Chinese woman from Guangdong province, and he did not make it strange. He read the words. I said what I was supposed to say. She said what she was supposed to say. Patterson signed the paper. On the way back to camp, she took my arm. Not in a soft way, in the way she did everything directly with purpose, her hand at my elbow and her stride matching mine and her eyes forward on the trail. The hills were winter bare. The creek sounded far off. My breath made vapor in the air. I thought, this is what's left of you, Thomas Crail. 16 cents and a deed and this. You went west because you needed a direction, and you found one, and it was this particular woman on this particular trail on this particular afternoon, with the winter light coming through the bare cottonwoods and her hand on your arm. It was not the life I had planned, but I was done with the life I had planned. That life was Clara's, and Clara's was gone, and what I had now was this. A woman who had watched me for 7 weeks and decided on evidence that I was worth keeping. Who had stood in her camp and not flinched when 2 large men loomed over her fire, and who had taught herself English from a hymnal because she needed to know things, and she was the kind of person who went and got what she needed. Who made rice flour cakes and knitted socks and twisted copper wire and panned silver in water that would stop your heart if you fell in it, and who did all of this without complaint or performance, just as the simple daily work of being alive in a hard place. She had chosen me. Not from lack of options. She had been in these hills for 2 years, and she had her own mind and her own competence, and she did not need me the way a drowning person needs a rope. She had chosen me the way a person chooses something good when good is available, and they are wise enough to recognize it. That is the hardest choice to accept, sometimes, not the desperate one, but the clear-eyed one, when someone who doesn't have to wants to. The confluence ran through February. We worked it until it ran out, which it did slowly the way all things run out. By March we had enough to buy passage to San Francisco and capital for a small enterprise there. She had an idea about a laundry, which was practical, and a contact, a man from her home province who had established one. We packed the camp in the last week of March. I rolled the bedroll, and when I rolled it the daguerreotype of Clara fell out. I'd forgotten it was there. I held it for a moment. Clara in 1848, 4 years before she died. She was looking at the camera the way she looked at most things, directly, with a slight impatience, as if the sitting for the photograph was taking longer than it needed to and she had other things to do. I looked at her face. I thought I carried you all this way. I thought I am still carrying you. I put the daguerreotype in the breast pocket of my coat where the deed had been. The deed I folded and put in the pack. 16 cents. I kept it for years, I have it still, or had it when I last looked, gone soft at the creases, the ink bled out, barely readable now. The deed for the thing that turned out to be worth nothing, and the starting place of everything. Mei Zing came to where I was standing. She looked at the daguerreotype, not prying, just a look of acknowledgement. Then she took the pack and put it on her back, which was her way of saying, "We're moving." I put the coat on. We walked down the mule track road in the April cold. The creek behind us and the hills going green again, and the road ahead leading to a larger road leading eventually to San Francisco. She walked with the same stride she always had, direct, purposeful, eyes forward. Her hat on her head with the copper wire on the crown catching the early light. She was not a woman who needed to be saved. She was not a woman who needed to be told she was beautiful or cherished or rescued from anything. She was a woman who had decided on evidence that I was steady. And steadiness, in the places she had been and the years she had lived, was the rarest thing there was. I had given her nothing she couldn't have found elsewhere. She had given me back myself, not the old self, that man was buried back in St. Louis with Clara and the Forsythia, but a self I could stand in, a self that was still useful, a self that could stand in a fire-lit camp and say she works with me and mean it all the way down. That was worth the trip, worth Eli Birch dying, worth 16 cents, worth every pan of iron filings in that cold water. We didn't talk much on the road to San Francisco. We didn't need to. The hills around us were alive with spring, and the creek faded behind, and she walked at my side with her hand not quite at my arm, just brushing it, warm through the coat, and the road went on ahead of us into whatever was coming next. I was not a young man. I knew that. I had gray hair and swollen knuckles and a photograph of my dead wife in my breast pocket, and a deed worth 16 cents in my pack, and I was 50 years old in 2 months, and the body keeps its accounts. But I was alive, that's what I mean to say. I was alive in the particular way that requires another person, not just breathing, not just going through the day, but alive in the sense of. There is a reason for the day, and the reason has a name, and the name is walking beside you on a California road in April with the hills going green and the light coming up and everything still ahead.